Hi, I'm Sean Duggan, and welcome to TheFIX, the podcast all about Lightroom, Photoshop, and the cool things you can do with your images in post-processing. In this episode, I'm going to be having a conversation about night photography and processing of night images with photographer and Lightroom instructor, David Marx. So stick with us as we head into the night. So I'm really excited about having this conversation with David because we haven't actually met before we got together today, although we've both been kind of orbiting in sort of parallel spheres of similar landscape activity and night photography and night time lapses and auroras. How you doing, David?
I'm doing great, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with you today.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thanks for coming on. This is actually a little bit of a we're kind of hearkening back to an episode of TheFIX that Jan recorded earlier in the summer, where you came on and gave a really great presentation on night photography. So if anybody has any interest in really getting the nitty-gritty of how to go out and properly shoot pinpoint focus stars and noise reduction and everything like that, definitely head back and check out that episode. And in this episode, we're just going to have more of a kind of a back and forth conversation because both David and I really love night photography and getting out under the stars, staying out way, way late to take pictures. And so we're just going to compare notes and share some tips and techniques. And hopefully you'll find that useful and interesting. So what do you got queued up to show us today, David?
Well, let's see. As you said, when I was on last time with Jan, we talked all about the nuts and bolts of night photography, focusing at night, exposure, that sort of thing. And one of my favorites is long exposures, the star trail looking photo where we get those arcs and swirls. So I thought this time, having talked at length last time about the pinpoint stars, frozen little dots, it might be fun to talk about sort of the opposite looking photo where instead of pinpoints, where we have those arcs. So let's see. So I put together, if you're interested, a little bit on some of the different star trail methods. And there are, as you know, really two ways to do this in today's world. The traditional way, where you shoot a single photo with a long, slow shutter speed, and the sort of more modern way where we shoot a sequence of photos, frame after frame after frame, and then composite them together in Photoshop or specialty software. If you're interested, I'll show you a little demo of some of this.
Yeah, let's take a look at that. And actually, as you queue up your screen share, let me just mention that of the two methods, they both have their pros and cons. You know, the one where you do a single exposure, of course, you don't have to worry about doing any of the post-processing in Photoshop. We have to post-process the image, of course, but you don't have to worry about doing any of the stacking or anything like that. But on the downside, of course, the camera is tied up for a long period of time, whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever. And then another issue, potential issue with the kind of single exposure star trails is that sometimes the sensor can get hot because it's just on all the time, and a hot sensor can yield to images which have a greater amount of noise.
That's true, and I think this is one of those areas in photography where it's worth learning more than one method. The advantage to multiple short frames is, of course, that the camera isn't tied up for hours, and that, as you said, we avoid that long exposure, that hot sensor noise. The downside is you have to use a very high ISO to get your pinpoint stars. So we trade long exposure noise for high ISO noise. And so, you know, I don't think there is a right and wrong here. But let me just hop forward a bit. Hopefully you're seeing some slides. A lot of these are slides, apologies, that I used with Jan, basically on the general settings for your camera at night. And just for a quick review here, this is a place where I think you got to shoot in RAW. Your JPEG file just isn't flexible enough for the noise reduction, the white balance, the contrast corrections that we're going to need in a nighttime image. And along the same lines, this is probably a place where you need to shoot in manual mode or bulb mode. That this is not hard photography by any means, but this is not point and shoot. And then the last, I skipped over a slide just to get started there, but the slide basically said everything you and I are going to talk about at night requires a tripod. The camera
Exactly.
has to be stable. None of this can be done handheld. And I think those are, none of that should be intimidating, but I think those are essentials, that this type of photography cannot be done without a good sturdy tripod.
Indeed, yeah. And one other thing that I wanted to add here is that in regards to manual exposure, and obviously if you're on bulb mode, that's going to be, a manual exposure. But you really gain nothing by an automatic or a semi-automatic exposure mode at night. In fact, you probably, lose more because the automatic or semi-automatic exposure modes on your camera are designed to respond to kind of a certain baseline situation in order to make a good exposure. And they operate on certain kind of basic assumptions that work well in situations where there is, a reasonable amount of light. But of course, when you're out in the dark, you don't have that. And so those systems just really aren't geared for operating in those conditions.
Absolutely. And a lot of folks, in my experience teaching field workshops, are really intimidated by taking their camera off P for program or, green circle, AV, A, aperture value. But at night, we really don't have, these are really pretty simple photos. We're going to go to manual mode for the most part. We're going to open the aperture in our lens wide open or almost wide open. And that's not going to change. We're going to stay at basically the widest iris we can get to let the most light in. Our ISO is going to be either very high for our pinpoint stars or low for our long single exposure. That's not likely to change. And then the only one that's really left to figure out is how much time, the shutter speed. And the beautiful part of the stars at night is you have hours basically to figure that out. So some of your frames are going to be underexposed, too little time. Some of them, it's possible to blow them out, too much time. But since the stars are, relatively speaking, a stable image, this is not like, say, sports photography where you get one frame. We can experiment in manual mode without a lot of fear. But just for a quick demo here, I use these slides with Jan, this would be a classic pinpoint star kind of photo, your defined Milky Way shot. And this is shot with a fairly fast shutter speed. Now, when I say fairly fast here, I mean 20 seconds. By daytime numbers, we couldn't call that fast at all, but we can call it fast when compared to hours or minutes. And again, wide open on the lens, f2.8, f4, f2, basically as much light as we can pour in, but a high ISO. Comparison-wise, this is sort of a classic star trail shot. This is 30 minutes, but at a much lower ISO. So at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about the trade-offs. The trade-off of a long exposure is going to be long exposure noise. It's going to be a hot sensor. The trade-off of a pinpoint photo is going to be high ISO noise. And depending on the camera, some will do one type better than the other. And then when we get to our processing, there are, say, different processing techniques for noise reduction from high ISO than from long exposure. Anyway, let me hop ahead here. The important one, though, for your star trails kind of photo, I would argue, is composition. If we want arcs and swirls, at least in the northern hemisphere, we need to aim the camera towards Polaris, towards the North Star. Now, this is, I made this little example using an app on my iPad, but basically, if you can find the Big Dipper, find the cup of the Big Dipper, at the end of the cup, follow it up, it will point to a not super bright star, but a pretty defined star. That's Polaris. And the reason this is important for today's discussion is if we want this, if we want that arc around a central point, that central point in our hemisphere, at least, is the North Star, is Polaris. So, somewhere in this blur down here is the Big Dipper. And technically, Polaris is at the end of the Little Dipper, Ursa Minor. But again, in the streaks, in the blur, we're not going to be able to pick out a distinct constellation. But if you want concentric, you basically have to aim at stellar north. If you aim at other parts of the sky, you'll get arcs that run in weird directions. In fact, if you aim west, you can get arcs that go in multiple directions. Anyway,
actually, I have a quick question on that or point, and actually later on, if necessary, I do have a star trail picture that's not the concentric circle. But I think we've probably all seen those photographs where you have the concentric circles. Obviously, the camera's pointed up at Polaris, at least in the northern hemisphere, and there are they left the camera open the entire night long to get almost full circles in some cases. Now, of course, back in the days of film, which is when I first started shooting night photography, that really wasn't a problem because, of course, the film was not an electronic image sensor which gets hot from constant use, and so you could easily do that. Is it possible these days with the digital sensors we have to leave it open all night long? Obviously, battery failure is going to be your main problem, but is it possible to have an exposure that is several hours long?
It is definitely possible to do several hours. You may need to use like a vertical grip or something that allows you to run, say, multiple batteries into the same camera, or an auxiliary battery. Some of the folks who shoot long exposures or time lapse will actually plug their camera into a separate external battery pack.
Yeah.
So it is certainly possible to keep them running for hours, but I wouldn't expect that off just one of these. And part of that is also going to be temperature dependent. Our lithium-ion batteries are somewhat, their battery life is shortened by the cold. The colder the environment, basically, the less life you get out of these. So there are limitations, and like all things digital, I think the Achilles heel is going to be that battery. But it can be done. I've shot using a vertical grip and multiple batteries. I've gone as long as about 3 hours in a single frame. Now, you're absolutely right, though, for the all-night photo. In some ways, the film camera, especially a manual film camera, all metal, where we had that squeeze bulb plunger, you locked it and it stayed locked. Those could go a theoretically infinite amount of time. But
the one film camera, I've got several film cameras, and I still shoot film in a wooden pinhole camera. But for my 35 millimeter SLRs, I still have a Nikon FM2, which is a fully manual camera. The only thing the battery powered was the light meter.
Right.
And of course, you don't need a light meter for night photography.
Wouldn't do you any good.
No, won't do you any good at all. So that is like the perfect camera if I wanted to go out and shoot, slide film and do one of those all-night shots. And it makes me think, well, gee, I'm going to be back in Iceland doing a winter landscapes and auroras workshop in March of 2016. Maybe I'll bring my Nikon FM2 and some slide film and try that out.
The only thing that I don't think the film camera will do as well, and we may be dating ourselves here with the words reciprocity failure or reciprocity problems. The problem with exposing film for hours is our colors begin to shift. All sorts of weird, discoloration would occur. Now, obviously, in the digital world, we can probably fix that. But I will say, to the digital camera's advantage, the white balance is the white balance, and that doesn't change over time. If you set it, like my advice is we set it to about 3200 Kelvin. It's kind of a blue-white balance. That's going to be consistent for minutes, hours, etc. And so, both technology, film and analog and digital, have some advantages and disadvantages. Well, let's see. Let me hop back into this screen share if I can here.
And while we're on this topic, I have one more thing to
Sure,
ask you that's just related to temperature and noise as a result of the sensor getting hot. I had an email from a friend of mine last week, and she was down in Lone Pine in the Eastern Sierras of California, so where the Alabama hills are, the Mobius Arch, Mount Whitney's right there. And they were doing some night photography in the Alabama hills. And she said it was just like really hot at night. I mean, it was quite warm. It never really cooled down. And she was doing, I think, 4-minute exposures, trying to do stacking of star trails. And she just said, with the heat of the sensor and her and the heat of the ambient temperature, she said that the noise was really just kind of almost like confetti when she stacked them all together. Now, the other thing that was not in her favor, she was not running a full frame sensor camera. She was running an APS-C sensor camera. So, obviously full frame sensors are better. So the question I had was, she asked me, do you think it would do any good if I got like a cold pack and strapped it to the back of the camera to help keep the camera temperature down? Have you ever experienced anything like that?
I don't think I should preface this by saying I'm not a physicist. I am not a camera manufacturing expert. The advice I have to give here is purely anecdotal and not based in any hard science.
I'm not a physicist, but I play one on TV.
Yeah, no. I would say with most of the digital cameras that the operating temperature of the sensor is not going to be altered by a hot pack or a cold pack taped to the outside of the camera body.
Yeah.
That the way these machines are built, like the first digital cameras, the earliest generation of Kodaks actually had a big fan that was to cool the sensor. And that was one of the big technical hurdles that, as I understand the sort of history of digital capture, the sensors get hot, they produce noise. But at this point, that technology has sort of reached a point where I don't think you and I could alter that ambient temperature of the sensor itself when it's running.
Right.
But my advice would be for your friend would be either shorten the exposure time and go for more pinpoint stars and stack them when you get home. Instead of shooting 4 minutes, let's shoot 20 seconds. And even in that little gap between frames, 1 second gap, the shutter drops, we shoot another 20 second. There's a little bit of time the sensor may cool down. But even at 20 seconds, it's not running as hard. It's not running as hot.
Right.
Or go the opposite. Instead of shooting 4-minute exposures and stacking them, let's shoot one 20-minute exposure or one 30-minute exposure. But then let's use the in-camera noise reduction feature, the long exposure noise reduction. And like for me, I love the long single exposure shot. And when I decide that I have it perfect, that's when I turn on that long exposure noise reduction, because it really does, even with, like this is a Canon 5D Mark III. Obviously at this point, not the latest and greatest Canon, but still pretty high-end camera. It gets really, there's a lot of sensor noise beyond the 3 or 4 minute mark. Even during daytime, if I'm shooting like long exposures with the ocean, the big ND filter, it gets noisy at about 3 minutes. But if I turn on that in-camera noise reduction feature, it does a phenomenal job canceling out that noise. I'll show you some examples here of how much cleaner it is. Now, the price is, of course, it does that long exposure noise reduction by shooting a second frame internally and comparing it to the first frame. So if your first exposure is 20 minutes, the in-camera frame will also be 20 minutes. That's 40 minutes before you can do anything. And so, one, we have to, again, worry about the battery life. Can your battery go 40 minutes? Because if it dies midway through, what do you get? And then, of course, there's the problem of what do I do while my camera is sitting there for 40 minutes and I'm standing around in the dark? Like how much how many beers can I drink? Or
I did that one night at Donner Summit in the Sierras. I shot a 3-hour time lapse of the Milky Way, and I did not have a second camera to play around with. So basically, I was just sitting up there at Donner Summit with my back against a rock. And fortunately, it was summertime. It was June. It was a comfortable temperature. And, I just kind of got into looking at the stars and, used my astronomy iPhone app to, identify stars. But it would have been nice to have had another camera on that particular night. I didn't, because it was just sort of, in the shop. And so, it's definitely good to have at least one other camera. So while you have one camera set up doing either a long exposure or a time exposure, you can go off and do other things and experiment with other compositions, much shorter exposures with a separate camera.
Yeah, and that's really, the beauty of the pinpoint star shots, the 30-second and less shots, is that you can do a whole bunch of different compositions in a couple of minutes. You can try this, you can try that. When we get to the long single shot, you're basically gambling. I'm gonna like this. I'm willing to sit. I'm willing to wait. I believe in my batteries, and lock it up. And that's one of the reasons, to go back to sort of how this conversation started. I think it's so worth learning both techniques, because I'm not confident. I think this battery can go an hour, hour and a half, but I'm not certain of that. So if I gamble at all, if I go out there and tell the camera, shoot me a 1-hour exposure, and I pop in this battery and it dies at 58 minutes, I got nothing out of that hour of my life. But if I shoot a couple of...
And let me just clarify for listeners here why you got nothing, or at least why I understand you got nothing. Because you certainly would have that 58-minute exposure, but what you would not have is the long exposure noise reduction, which would have done another 58 minutes after the fact. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Because the total exposure time, if we tell it to do 1 hour and long exposure noise reduction, that's 2 hours that the camera is running. And if the battery dies before those 2 hours are up, nothing was finalized on the memory card. The file that is there is incomplete. And so, the advantage of pinpoint stars is you can get a whole lot of them. And that's sort of the great part of, like say of time lapse. If I set my camera up to shoot, you were saying time lapse up at Donner Summit, if the battery dies sooner than you expected, your time lapse sequence will be shorter, but at least you've got a sequence of frames. Yeah. Now with those, we can composite together. We can make a short time lapse, a 1-second clip, a 5-second clip. When you need a 10-second clip for time lapse, again, we start worrying about the battery.
Yeah.
Can it go this long? And so, all things digital, this is a Achilles heel. Well, here, let me show, just so since we're off on the topic here, let me show a couple of, on the method that I like. I shouldn't say the method I like them both, but the one that I didn't talk about last time really is the long exposure, single frame settings. So when you want to go single frame, long exposure, and again, to your friend, my advice might have been try a 20-minute exposure. You got to have that camera on the tripod. And for this, you got to go to the bulb mode on the camera. And so if manual is scary, bulb is even scarier for a lot of people. Because in bulb, the camera is no longer setting the shutter speed, the exposure time. So we need some other device. We need a cable release. We need an intervalometer. We need something that can lock the camera up and keep it that way. So before I would do this, I would definitely shoot some pinpoint images, high ISO, shorter shutter speed. And my advice is that you shoot those pinpoints, make sure everything is the way you want it, and then you start building out in time. So shoot a 1-minute exposure. It's not going to have good star trails. I know I'm going to delete it, but at least it will let me check there in the field that I like what's going on. And then I might try a 5-minute exposure, and I'll build my way up until I'm confident that everything is exactly the way I want it. Then I might change camera batteries and shoot the really long one. And for the really long one, there's really no reason to up the ISO. ISO 100, 200, 400, fine. Keep it low, because we're going to get our brightness from the length of time rather than from the ISO boost out of the camera. That when we shoot our pinpoint stars, we crank the ISO way up, 3200, 6400. We need that high ISO to boost the exposure. In this case, we don't. For the aperture, usually when we're shooting star trails, we open our lens up its widest setting, f2, f4, whatever the widest is. But for my pinpoint stars, the wider the aperture, the better. For the long exposure stuff, I usually stop the lens down about 1 stop from its widest. And I do that for 2 reasons. I do that, one, because most lenses are not at their crispest, their sharpest, at their widest absolute aperture. So by closing down about 1 stop, I am costing myself some light, but I'm gaining a little sharpness. And again, I'm going to make that light back, but that exposure, that brightness back, by letting the shutter run longer and longer and longer. And then, again, if we're experimenting, turn long exposure noise reduction off. Shoot your 1-minute frame. See if you like it. Shoot your 5-minute frame. But when you're really serious about going 20 minutes, if you have the battery life, I'd say turn it back on. But again, as we've been talking, that means you're really creating a 40-minute exposure total. So here, I'll show my little sequence. This is my 1-minute exposure, a test image. It's okay. The stars are a little bit of a streak, but they're not really an arc. This is a 1-minute. This is a 5-minute. And there's a math formula about how much arc you actually get per minute. I think it's something like 2 degrees, but don't quote me on it. Again, I'm not a physicist, not an astronomer. For every minute, though, for every 10 minutes, those arcs get longer. This is what 5 minutes looks like. This is what 10 minutes looks like. And then this would be, say, 20 minutes. And at this point, this is when I think we start to get what I would call interesting arcs or swirls out of our sky. For me, the interesting point happens at about 20 minutes and longer. And these others, they're basically my test frames. And that's why, your friend was saying she was shooting 4-minute exposures to composite together. To me, and this is purely personal opinion, 1 4-minute frame isn't quite enough arc to really thrill me. I'm going to need a sequence of them. But those 4-minute frames, I don't see any advantage to doing those over 1 20-minute, 30-minute, 40-minute, if you have the battery life. Now, again, this long exposure noise reduction, I've got this slide on it because it causes so much confusion. If you turn it on, you will get much cleaner photos. And I'll show you an example here in a minute. But it doubles the exposure time. And so I don't think we want to use it when we're shooting pinpoint stars, like in a time lapse, or if you're going to stack together a sequence of short exposures, that gap is going to be quite noticeable. But when we're doing a single long frame, it can make things a lot cleaner. So here again, just for the doing the thing, this was my pinpoint shot just the other night. This is a lake near my house. I live up by Glacier National Park. So this is a 20-something second exposure, wide open on the lens at ISO 6400. It's okay. I like it as a pinpoint shot. But when I want to go for the arc, I start slowing things down. So the ISO goes down. This is to say ISO 200. The exposure time goes up. This is 20 minutes. Now I'm getting that cool motion. Now this is a 40-minute exposure, much longer arc. And this is all off a single battery. At least on my camera, I believe it can do that much at a time. But between 20 minutes and 40 minutes, I change batteries, right? I bring a whole bunch of fresh spares with me so that I'm not gambling on, well, let's see, the last one was 20 minutes and then I shoot another one. Now I've had the camera running on 1 battery for an hour and a half. I don't have that much confidence in them. So I change batteries a lot between these shots. So here's our 40-minute exposure. Now, when I zoom them in, and so these are blow-ups, and I apologize, this usually doesn't show very well in the videos, but in the ISO 6400 shot, the 20-second exposure, there's a little bit of what you and I would call luminance noise, this dark speckle up there in the sky. But it's tolerable. And I think Lightroom does a really good job canceling out a little bit of noise, especially the colored noise, the false red and green spots. In a 20, 30-second exposure, Lightroom can handle that no problem. But when I show that 20-minute exposure, if you look down here in the trees, what ought to be an inky black, I think you'll start to see some hot spots, a red spot, a white spot, a green spot. And I apologize.
Yeah, they show up.
They show up? Yeah, it's really hard to project these. This is the problem with long exposure, right? That we get these false dots. And Lightroom really isn't very good at removing them. And I don't mean to pick on Lightroom here. It's just beyond what it's expected to do. So this is the 20-minute shot without the in-camera long exposure noise reduction. This is the 40-minute shot with the in-camera noise reduction. Mm-hmm. Now that means the total time here that the camera had to run was 80 minutes. Let me add one thing here. I didn't sit there for the whole 80 minutes. This was the last shot of the evening. Once the 40 minutes were up, once the mirror had dropped, I put the lens cap back on the camera. I didn't turn it off or anything, but we drove home, right? It can shoot its dark slide while I'm driving. I don't have to sit there the whole 80 minutes, but compare the difference in noise, and that's being canceled out basically automatically for me. The camera is doing it, but at the cost of 80 minutes without being able to shoot another photo.
Right. Yeah. No, that's pretty significant.
And then the other reason, the one other advantage, since we're talking the comparison to two, one other reason why I like doing a single long exposure is it gives you time to add additional lights, or perhaps additional lights show up during that time. If you're shooting like a 20-second exposure, 20 seconds, it's not a lot of time for light painting, where you swing your flashlight over the objects in your foreground to add some detail. 20 seconds isn't a lot of time, since you and I both teach aurora workshops. For the slightest hint of an aurora, the faintest sky glow that the human eye might not see, but the camera can, to pop up. So I'll just show three more examples here. When you go for 40 minutes, you have a lot of time to, say, paint light over that schoolhouse. All the detail you see in the foreground there is there because I illuminated it with my flashlight. Otherwise, it would all be an inky black silhouette, like the stuff I hadn't illuminated. But to add that much light to the scene would be really hard to do in 20 seconds or 30 seconds. This would be a really hard shot to pull off if we were stacking individual exposures. So long exposure allows for more light painting. It allows for stuff like this, that hint of an aurora at the horizon, very faint, but measurable that night in Montana. Now, to my eye, all I could kind of pick out was a little glow. I was like, yeah, there's something going on at the horizon, but I can't really tell what it is. But give the camera 25 minutes, it can. Or this, up at the edge of the Arctic. Again, a faint glow to the eye, but with 15 minutes to the camera, it's full of color, full of light. Or one last, this is over Glacier National Park. Now this night, the aurora was visible, but it was doing its kind of green haze thing. It wasn't the beautiful bands and arcs that I love to see. It was just that green horizon line, from my latitude at least. So I went for a long exposure, knowing that the light that was in the sky would be multiplied, magnified by the long exposure time and reflected in the lake surface below it. So, again, both techniques here, I'll stop this screen share here. Both techniques have advantages and disadvantages. But the long one is, to me, the often more interesting of the two, less predictable.
Right, yeah. It's interesting that you had the aurora shots in a really long exposure, because I've never actually photographed the aurora with such long exposures. I've done a lot of aurora photography up in Iceland when I've taught workshops up there, and most of the time I'm going for the pinpoint stars and the auroras. And then the other thing is that sometimes I've been up there times when they've just been so active that I cannot even imagine having an exposure that long, because they would just blast out the, it would look like the sky was blown out, and overexposed.
Yeah, and to be clear, when the aurora is active, when we're getting our pillars and arcs and moving, I'm not going to shoot a long exposure. I'm going for the quickest exposure I can,
Right.
Both for time lapse or that single still frame, because I want as much definition to the bands, the shape of the aurora. But often here, at least in Montana, we get the faint horizon line aurora. We get that hint of, but not the booming bright that you see at further north latitudes.
Mm-hmm.
And the same, it's not just auroras. We get light pollution, air glow, a number of different reflected light effects that illuminate the sky possibly below the human eye's threshold to really pick them up, but not below the camera's threshold. And that's, one of the things that I think is so amazing at this point is that our cameras really can see in the dark. They can see things that you and I just can't.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, and when you're photographing auroras, oftentimes when they first show up in the evening, they're not very pronounced. They're very faint. And oftentimes you see them on your camera first before you actually notice them with your eyes. You're just sort of taking night shots, and you look at the back of the camera and you see this faint greenish glow, and then you realize, aha, they're here. And then if luck and the aurora spirits are with you, then they start, really putting on a show.
Yeah. And for me, often for me, depending on where I am in Montana, it's amazing how far light pollution travels. And, Montana's a pretty rural state. We don't have a lot of lights, but I can be 20 miles away from town. And if I look in one direction, maybe I can see the sky is a little lighter, but I'm not real conscious of it. But if I aim the camera that way, it is noticeably different than when I aim it off in another direction. And right. I see the same thing, we were talking about places we teach on the coast of Maine. If you aim the camera out towards the Atlantic, over the ocean, it is a very different exposure, very different photo than when you aim it south towards Boston, New York, Portland. It's amazing how far light travels, especially with a little bit of cloud cover. It will bounce, light will reflect for miles and miles.
Yeah. So let's get into the, so we've seen the long exposure star trails.
Okay.
Let's talk about the process for doing the short exposure, more pinpoint type exposures where you're taking many of them and then stacking those up. Because that is what's amazing about that technique is that, it's kind of involved and time consuming, because if you want long trails, you have to take quite a lot of photos, 50, 60, 100, 200, whatever, or more. But once you actually get all those files together in one big, huge Photoshop file with all of these layers, it's a, surprisingly easy thing to do.
Okay. And I would add further there, it's the backbone of learning time lapse as well. That we're basically, since we're dealing with raw files, we're going to process one photo, and then we're going to copy and paste those settings to 10 others, 20 others, 100 others, 1,000 others. That's where our time-lapse photography basically comes from. So I think it's a great technique, because once you master it, you're really gaining multiple skills.
Right. So for example purposes, this is just a small subset of many images that I took this night. This is actually part of a time lapse. So this kind of touches on that point you made earlier, David, where the same principle you would go about for doing star stacks can also be used for time lapse, because you're basically just taking many pictures in very quick succession. And these here, just to give us an idea of what was going on, this is ISO 6400. a 28 millimeter lens, f3.5, and these were 30-second exposures. So, and the what I did was I adjusted one picture and then selected all of the pictures, and then chose the sync settings button in the library module, or if I was in the develop module, it would be the synchronize button. And I synchronized the settings from the one picture that I had adjusted to all the rest. So that way I have all the same settings applied to all of them. And I'm not going to go through that here in this case. Now, the other thing is that these pictures here, just for demo purposes, to make this go a little bit faster, these are already JPEGs that I had exported for the time lapse. So I'm just going to use these to show you how you would go from many star photos in Lightroom into Photoshop to set it up as a star stack. And let me also just mention here that this is one of these cases where the stars are not in focus. And this was sort of an experiment that I was running, mainly because I knew that if I focused on this tree, that the stars would be out of focus. So I kind of was faced with this compromise that I had to make, which was, well, if I have the stars in focus, the tree is not going to be in focus. And if I have the trees in focus, the stars are not going to be in focus. But I kind of rationalized that by saying to myself, well, since I'm doing a time lapse and it's going to be presented, smaller, basically, on video dimensions, I can get by with that. So that's why in this particular image here, the stars are slightly soft. And at 30 seconds, they're even showing a little bit of streaking.
But in this case, since you're going to put them into a blur or a streak,
yeah,
I don't think anyone will object.
Yeah, and so that is actually another reason why with the star stack you could potentially get by with stars that are slightly softer in terms of their focus, because if they're just going to be streaks of light across the sky, you don't really notice it as much. So in the case of this particular image, I really felt I needed to have the tree in focus since it was much closer to me and was kind of a central element in the picture. All right, so I've got the first one selected. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select the last one. Then I would just come up to the photo menu and I would choose Edit in, Open as Layers in Photoshop. Now, I've actually already set this up, so we don't have to wait for it to do this. If you're doing this with many images, it can take a while. So just put on your imagination caps and pretend that I did this and it happened really fast. So if we look in Photoshop here, you can see my layers panel has got, I think there's about 19 or 20 of these pictures here. And they're all just separate layers there. Again, this is sort of a smaller res down version for quick demo on the show here. So I'm just going to select all of the layers. I'll just make sure my top layer is selected here, and then I'll come down and I'll shift click on the bottom layer. And you can see in the layers panel that all of those layers are now selected. All I have to do to create the star stack, and let me actually just zoom up a bit so we can see this in all of its glory. All I have to do is come to the blend mode menu at the top of the layers panel and set the blend mode to lighten. And it does it. Now, this is a short one. I actually have the full version up here that I made from, I can't recall now. I think it was maybe 50 or 60 or 70 shots. I can't even remember now. But one thing I wanted to point out, if I zoom up to 100% here, you can see that there is this little, almost segmented aspect to these star trails. And let me actually just sort of come up even more. Is that kind of coming through there on your end, David?
Mm-hmm. They have a little jaggedy to them.
Yeah, and so keep in mind that these are pictures where the stars were out of focus, but that segmented quality is due to the fact that unlike a continuous exposure, such as you were showing earlier, where you just have one continuous exposure and the moving stars or I guess in this case it would be the moving Earth causing the stars to move, or appear to move, is creating one continuous trail of light. With this one, even though I was on an intervalometer and it was just taking one picture after another, there is that slight delay between when the shutter closes, the mirror comes down, and then the shutter opens up again. Now, if I was on mirror lockup, there wouldn't be the motion of the mirror to deal with in terms of causing a delay, but there still would be a very small delay between exposures, even if the intervalometer was set to sort of be banging them off sequentially one after another.
Yeah, and there are ways, like I use a program called Star Stacks for this kind of work. It's a free utility. It has a gap filling mode, and
yeah,
I have seen Photoshop scripts and actions that try and fill those little gaps or they add a little blur basically to hide them away. But for most folks, again, I think for most folks, that tiny bit of gapping, myself, I guess I should point to here, that's not a problem to me. I don't object to the sort of more jagged edge feel.
Mm-hmm. And
oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say that it's certainly an easier and more convenient way to get a star streak image than if you were having to wait 40 minutes to do this.
One other advantage to add here is you never know when the airplanes will fly over or the clouds will roll in. And if you lock the camera up for half an hour, 40 minutes, and then a whole bunch of planes fly through your image, you get the trails of those aircraft. Or if it fogs over or clouds up, you got nothing. But if you shoot frame after frame like you have here, instead of getting, say, 30 photos you could use, but if a plane flies over 10 frames in, well, at least the first 9 frames are usable. Or after the plane passes over, maybe the next 20 frames are usable. So I think this method, it gives you the possibility of time lapse. It gives you the possibility of editing out or working around unpredictable events. But it does come at the cost of having to process all those photos, send them to Photoshop or another utility, and then save out yet another file.
Right. Yeah. And then the other thing to point out here too, for those people who are watching the video version of this show, is that unlike some of the star trail pictures that you showed earlier, most of which were oriented around Polaris, the North Star, so you got that nice circular arc in the sky. This one, of course, was not oriented around Polaris, and so you just have this more kind of wavy diagonal sweep, which is interesting in its own way, but it definitely helps to be familiar with the movement of the heavens, to use a lofty phrase, so you can plan your shots so that they come out more like you are expecting rather than a total surprise.
Although in this case, I think the arcs passing by your tree in that center foreground look really nice. And without being there, I don't know what you would have had if you had to reposition yourself so the tree was between you and the North Star.
It would have been different, and I would have had to get on the other side of the tree and shoot in the other direction, because here I'm looking southwest. And then I'm getting some light from the Sacramento Valley down here. That's what that kind of orangey yellow light is. And then in the other direction, I would have had the light from Truckee and Reno and Lake Tahoe. So this is not out in the middle of nowhere by any means, even though it is up in the mountains. So there's always going to be some light pollution there.
Yeah.
I just also wanted to point out that
that's cool.
This basic technique of that light and blend mode can be used for other things as well, not just stars. So in this shot here, let me just make it a little bit bigger so it fills the screen more. This again is up at Donner Summit. This is the Summit Road right up here. This kind of gate where you see this house in the background, or this building, that is the summit and the old highway. But I had several shots here going for the car going by, and then the next layer is just bringing in the glow from another car, and that layer is set to lighten, just as in the previous example with the star trails. Next, I have another layer which brings in some light painting with a flashlight. Again, that's set to lighten. And then finally, I have yet another layer where I was focusing on just the stars, because of course in all of these other layers the stars are moving, and now since I'm stacking them up, I'm getting these sort of repeating almost Morse code looking stars up in the sky, dots and dash. And then I basically brought in a separate exposure of just the stars looking good. Unfortunately, it was off center a little bit, so I did have to make, I think I bumped the tripod with my foot and jostled the camera, which is not the thing you want to do after spending many minutes setting up a shot like this. But I had to make this, layer mask that is a combination of being very detailed and somewhat loose and goosey there on the edges. But that basic technique of using the light and blend mode works for many different aspects of night photography, not just getting star trails.
Yeah, that's a cool one. I've not done anything nearly that complicated. Oh, that's beautiful.
Well, so this one, where was I? Yeah, so the Summit Road, this is actually an exercise from my lynda.com course on enhancing night and low light photographs. So this is one where in the course we kind of build it up from scratch and do all the masking and get the sky, which was slightly off alignment from the rest of the shots, to line up. So it's a fairly involved exercise. And since I kind of come from a masking and compositing background where I feel very comfortable with that, that's something that I just sometimes I do regard the scene in a night photograph. I see it as sort of different plates or different layers. I know I've got my sky layer and I've got the foreground layer, and if necessary I can use multiple exposures and masking to get what I want. And then this shot here, similar technique, although all done manually. This is down in the Joshua Tree area of Southern California. And what's happening here is I had this shot here, which a longer exposure that I took to get more of just sort of the illumination of the roadside and some of the vegetation out in the desert. And then I have this shorter exposure, which I took specifically to get the light trails from the car. And then I just have a layer mask that is blending the two of these together. So this is all sort of manual masking. Here you can see what that layer with the car light trails looks like when it is, when it doesn't have the other layer underneath adding to it.
Cool. And
then of course I've got some other adjustments to darken the sky down, to increase the glow, red glow on the road, and just sort of modify the side. So that's kind of more of an old school approach, if that can be used to something as relatively recent in history as Photoshop, of kind of doing the same thing without relying on the light and blend mode here. Wow. Actually, the light and blend mode would not work in this case because it would make it all too light, because there's lots of areas in the underlying layer which are just too light, and so that wouldn't work out.
Right, and obviously you can explain this far better than me, but for those who don't know, if I understand it right, the light and blend mode tells Photoshop if what's on this layer is lighter than what's underneath it, then show it. Is that a...
Yeah, essentially, yes. It basically is doing a pixel for pixel comparison of the layer, the active layer versus whatever is underneath, and it compares each pixel as they are arranged on top of each other essentially, and it basically figures out which one is lighter and it shows that one.
Right, and in this case, your upper layer has Yeah, and that's why it's not going to work for you. That's why you had to add a manual mask here. It's
Right, because if you look at both of these pictures, there's a lot of really light area in the sky, and obviously the vegetation in the surrounding desert is very light in the bottom layer, but in the top layer, the sky is darker. The only thing that's really lighter is the light trails and maybe some of the illumination off on the side there. So if this was set to lighten, which I'll do again right now, it just sort of gets too light. Now, in some images, this could be an interesting look, but in this particular image, I'm losing the nice kind of twilight blue color of the sky.
right.
I'll set that back to normal there. So that's kind of a more old school approach of just using, and these are not by any means precise masks. So if you look at that, that's a pretty pretty loose fuzzy edge mask, and most of the masks in this file are pretty loose here.
But the results are beautiful.
They do the job. They do the job. That's the important part. All right. Well, that was a pretty cool exploration. It was nice to actually have a little bit of back and forth and share some of our work and talk to a fellow night photographer. It definitely is a calling and a bug you get sometimes. And actually, this summer I haven't had as much time to go out and do as much night photography as I would like. So I'm kind of feeling the itch now. That's one reason why I like winter, is because it gets dark sooner in the winter. So in a way, even though it's colder, it's easier to do night photography because it gets dark sooner. You don't have to stay out as late, and oftentimes the sky is very crisp and clear in the winter. I'm sure you find that is true up in Montana.
Yeah. Well, and in the summer for us, the day goes from it's daylight till in June 11 at night till 4 in the morning.
Wow, that's
we're
pretty
not
good.
to the Arctic. The sun does set, but
Right.
to get truly dark skies in June here, you're up awfully late.
Yeah, and I've run into that before when I've tried to do night photography in June. That same problem. Of course, for getting really good shots of the Milky Way, summertime typically is best in this hemisphere anyway.
Yeah.
So, David, you have some winter workshops, I know, coming up in a couple of locations. So why don't you tell people where they can find you on the web and tell us a little bit about those workshops you got coming up.
Oh, thank you. I'm pretty easy to find on the web. It's davidmarx.com, M-A-R-X. If you can remember my name, you have found my website. And I have 2 workshops that might be of interest to the folks who are watching this coming up. In early February, I will teach a workshop in Yellowstone National Park, winter photography in Yellowstone. And weather permitting, we usually spend at least 1 or 2 nights out photographing at Old Faithful. One of the first photos I showed was a Old Faithful star swirl, and that's a lot of fun. It's amazing to be out there at this, American icon, all alone in the winter on a clear, cold night. Truly a different photo than what you would get at noon in August. So I have a winter in Yellowstone class coming up in early February, and then end of February, I teach a night skies and the Northern Lights class, basically a whole workshop devoted to stuff we've been talking about, star trails, auroras, and that one's up in Churchill, Manitoba, at the edge of the Arctic, where the skies are really dark, and that's a ton of fun. A week of night photography.
Is Churchill right up there on the edge of the Arctic Circle?
No, it's actually at the Hudson Bay, so it's at about it's not as far north as Iceland or the Arctic Circle, but in terms of climate, it's basically where tundra hits, tundra boreal forest hits pack ice. And so, so you're in a very cold, very dark place, although you're not latitude-wise quite as far north.
And for some people that might sound scary. You tell them you're going to be in a very cold, very dark place. But for a night photographer, it's like, yeah, sign me up.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't lie to anyone. That is a very cold place, but their skies are amazing, and they get these other properties of cold weather, different types of ice that are beautiful, lots of halos around the sun, around the moon. Just a fascinating place to visit.
It sounds cool. Sounds like, and we'll put links to your webpage and your workshop page in the show notes. And I'll also include some links to the night photography courses that I have on lynda.com that I mentioned in there as well. And again, thanks so much for stopping by. It was great to talk with you and kind of schmooze and talk shop about night photography and processing night images. Appreciate you coming by.
Well, thank you for the fabulous conversation and for showing me some cool Photoshop tricks. I'm going to have to mess with that. Have to experiment with that light and blended mode.
There you go. My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, that is our show for this episode. So thank you for joining us. You can always find us on iTunes. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes for the audio-only version. And you can also go to thisweekinphoto.com, TheFIX, or thisweekinphoto.com/TheFIX to see the video version. And of course, that's where the show notes are going to be. And while you're there, check out some of the other cool podcasts at thisweekinphoto.com. I'm Sean Duggan. Thanks for watching. Go forth and pixelate.